members. Now recognizing the member from Kelowna Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Today I rise to speak to Bill 14, a piece of legislation that claims to streamline the approval process for energy projects in BC. And let me begin by stating clearly, we agree with the intention. We agree that energy projects, whether transmission lines, generational infrastructure, or other essential systems, are taking far too long to get off the ground in this province. We hear it from industry, from local communities, and from everyday British Columbians. The current process is too slow, too fragmented, and too costly. Developers are stuck navigating a maze of ministries. Timelines stretch on for years. And good projects that would benefit our economy and energy reliability, are often stalled or abandoned because the permitting process has become a burden. That needs to change. British Columbia should be a place where investment is welcomed, where jobs are created, and where critical infrastructure can be built without getting lost in a bureaucratic dead end. That's something this side of the House has consistently advocated for, and to the extent that Bill 14 attempts to address that, we support that direction. But what concerns us, and should concern every member in this chamber, is not what this bill claims to do, but how it goes about doing it. This bill doesn't just cut red tape, it cuts out the role of the Legislature. It gives the Cabinet the power to designate projects without public input, to waive oversight mechanisms, and to hand broad regulatory authority to unelected officials. It allows the BC Energy Regulator to rewrite the rules that govern its own actions without ever coming back to this House for debate, approval, or accountability. It even allows for retroactive decisions, including the power to impose levies or fees on proponents for actions taken months ago, before this legislation even existed. That is a dangerous precedent. Because when government begins to bypass public scrutiny in the name of efficiency, what we end up with is neither fast nor fair. We get concentrated power, unstable rules, and a system that serves neither developers nor the public. So while the government is positioning this bill as a breakthrough for energy permitting, I see something else, a deeply concerning expansion of executive authority with few safeguards and almost no accountability. And that's why I'll be addressing in greater detail today. That's what I'll be addressing in greater detail today, because we can do better. We can support faster project approvals without sacrificing the role of this Legislature and the trust of the people that we serve. Honourable Speaker, before I get into the more troubling aspects of this legislation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge where we do find common ground, because there are parts of this bill that reflect priorities that we've been calling for in this House for some time. Let's start with something that's been long overdue, a single window approach to permitting. For years, project proponents, whether they're working on energy transmission lines, regional generation projects, or emerging technologies, have faced a confusing, time-consuming approval process that spans multiple ministries and regulatory bodies. This isn't just inefficient, it's a barrier to investment. Too many good projects have died on the vine, not because they were flawed, but because the system around them was too slow, too convoluted, or too uncertain to navigate. So the move towards consolidating permitting under a more unified framework is welcome. And if done properly with proper oversight, and transparency, it can absolutely help get important energy infrastructure moving again. And Honourable Speaker, let me say this as clearly as I can. We want to see energy projects move forward in BC. We support responsible development. We support investment, and we support jobs. We support building the infrastructure that will allow our province to meet its growing energy demands, not 5 or 10 years from now, but today. We understand that BC cannot remain competitive or reliable if we keep sending investors the message that maybe someday is the best we can offer. And we've heard time and time again from project developers that they don't just want speed. They want clarity, certainty, and consistency. They want to know what the rules are. They want to know the timelines. They want to know that if they meet the requirements, they will get a fair hearing and a fair shot. That's not a partisan issue. That's just good governance. and for far too long we haven't had it. So yes, the Conservative caucus supports the core goal of making energy permitting in this process faster, more efficient, and more navigable. We support changes that reduce unnecessary delays and duplication. We support making the BC Energy Regulator more responsive and better resourced to handle modern project timelines. But we also support something else, something that this bill unfortunately starts to cast aside, and that's accountability. Because if we want to build a system that works for British Columbians, one that earns their trust, attracts investment, and gets shovels in the ground, then we have to ensure that the reforms we make are rooted in transparency, in legislative oversight, and in public confidence. That's the balance this bill could have struck with Bill 14. This government could have struck with Bill 14. And that's the balance we'll be fighting to restore through debate and proposed amendments. Honourable Speaker, as I announced I'm having trouble with words today. As I outlined just moments ago, there are aspects of Bill 14 that are worth supporting, ideas that could help streamline the path forward for energy development in our province. But this is where the agreement ends. Because while the government presents this bill as a common sense update to reduce duplication and delay, the legislation itself goes much farther, too far. What Bill 14 actually does beneath the headlines and press releases is hand-sweeping, unchecked authority to the Cabinet and to the BC Energy Regulator. Let's start with what I believe is the most egregious overstep. This bill gives Cabinet the power to fundamentally change how energy projects are reviewed and approved without ever coming back to this Legislature. Under this bill, the Lieutenant Governor and Council can declare by regulation what constitutes a streamlined project. That means they can add, remove, or redefine projects behind closed doors without debate, without input, and without any obligation to explain those decisions publicly. And it doesn't stop there. The bill goes on to grant Cabinet the power to exempt entire projects from the environmental assessment process. Again, not by legislation, but by regulation. Not only are the criteria unclear, they are entirely discretionary. If Cabinet says a project is exempt, then it's exempt, full stop. No hearings, no public submissions, no independent evaluation. Now, Honourable Speaker, that might be acceptable if this was limited to a narrow, clearly defined set of projects, but it's not. This bill leaves the door wide open for any project to be added later and for all the usual safeguards to be switched off. That should concern every member in this House, not just those on this side. It gets worse. Bill 14 also allows the BC Energy Regulator to change, suspend, or even eliminate parts of the very act that governs its activities, the Energy Resource Activities Act, again, without legislative input. Let's pause on that for a moment. We are literally giving a regulator the power to rewrite its own rule book. No vote, no accountability, no transparency. And if that wasn't alarming enough, the bill also gives the regulator the authority to impose fees and levies retroactively, all the way back to April 1st, 2024. Let me be clear, we're not talking about future costs or predictable fee schedules that proponents can plan for. We are talking about rules that haven't been debated yet, costs that haven't been disclosed, and obligations that could be applied months after the fact. What business, what developer, what investor would feel confident operating in a jurisdiction where rules can be changed retroactively and arbitrarily? This is not regulatory reform. This is legal instability. And we have to call it what it is, a profound shift in how decisions are made in this province. We are witnessing the slow erosion of democratic process, replaced by a growing reliance on regulation, ministerial direction, and executive orders. It's a pattern we've seen before with Bill 7, Bill 15, and now again with Bill 14. Let's not kid ourselves. This is not about getting projects built faster. This is about government getting out of the way, not for the sake of the public, but for the sake of consolidating control. British Columbians are not opposed to efficiency. They are opposed to being shut out of decisions that affect their future. As members of this legislature, regardless of party, we should be concerned whenever government attempts to sidestep the very institution we were elected to uphold. We are not here to rubber stamp cabinet decisions. We are not here to hand over our authority to regulators. We are here to represent the people of our ridings, and to ensure that when laws are made, they are made here with transparency, debate, and accountability. That is the role of this House. And that is the line that Bill 14 crosses, not just in one place, but throughout the entire framework of this legislation. I'll be addressing even more of these powers in detail, including the ability to suspend established rules around safety standards, environmental oversight, and public rights of appeal. But for now, let me just say this. Streamlining is not a license to override democracy. And we must not let efficiency become a Trojan horse for unchecked executive power. Honourable Speaker, one of the most frustrating challenges we hear from project proponents, whether they're in energy infrastructure or construction, is not simply the amount of regulation they face, it's the uncertainty of it all. Uncertainty about timelines, uncertainty about requirements, uncertainty about what rules apply, or whether those rules will change midstream. And I want to be clear, Bill 14 does not solve that problem, it deepens it. Because while this bill is being sold as a way to bring clarity and speed to energy permitting in BC, what it actually introduces is a whole new level of unpredictability. And it does so in some deeply troubling ways. Let's begin with retroactivity. Clause 12 of this bill allows the BC Energy Regulator or individuals it delegates authority to impose fees, levies, or other financial obligations retroactively to April 1st, 2024. Now think about that. We're telling project developers that decisions they made in good faith, based on rules as they existed at the time, could be revisited and recosted under a completely different regime, a regime that wasn't even law when they acted. What's worse, there's no requirement that these retroactive levies be reasonable, predictable, or appealable. They're simply imposed after the fact, and project proponents are expected to comply. Honourable Speaker, this is a dangerous precedent. How do you attract investment into this province when businesses can't rely on the rules staying consistent for even a matter of months? When a project that was fully permitted in March could be hit with unexpected fees by July, not because anything changed on the ground, but because government rewrote the terms after the fact. This isn't just poor planning. It's a signal to every potential investor that BC's regulatory system is unstable, unreliable, and subject to political whim. And unfortunately, this bill doesn't stop at retroactive costs. It also gives Cabinet and the BC Energy Regulator the power to designate, redefine, or remove entire classes of projects from existing oversight at will. Under Clause 20, the Lieutenant Governor and Council may by regulation decide what qualifies as a renewable resource, whether a project is subject to environmental assessment or not, whether a particular project is eligible for streamlining and what level of streamlining it receives, and whether certain safety or reporting requirements should apply. Now, this may sound procedural, just background policy stuff, but let's not miss the point. These are decisions that used to be predictable, debated, and codified in law. Under Bill 14, they are turned into moving targets, subject to change at any time by regulation, with no guarantee of public consultation or advance notice. After that, Honourable Speaker, is the exact opposite. That is the exact opposite of regulatory certainty. Let me put it another way. This bill trades transparency for flexibility, but in the most one-sided way possible. Government gets the flexibility. Developers get the uncertainty. And for British Columbians, they're left in the dark. Consider this. A project could begin its development process under one framework based on publicly available criteria with a reasonable understanding of its obligations. And then partway through, or even after completion, Cabinet could issue a regulation that reclassifies the project, imposes new costs, or removes protections that were previously in place. What message does that send? It tells investors that the goalposts can and will be moved. It tells communities that their input can be erased. It tells regulators that they're no longer implementing law, they're rewriting it on the fly. And I would argue that all of this does more harm to energy development in this province than the red tape this government claims to be cutting. Because at the end of the day, Honourable Speaker, developers don't just want speed. They want stability. They want to know that once a rule is established, once a permit is issued, once a plan is approved, it will hold. Not indefinitely, not without accountability, but with the basic fairness that says, we stand by the rules we gave you when we started. Bill 14 throws that principle out the window. It replaces a flawed system, yes, one that needs reform, with a discretionary system governed by regulation and open to sudden change. And that makes it harder, not easier, to build the kind of long-term energy infrastructure this province needs. Because serious investors don't chase political unpredictability. They look for jurisdictions where the rules are clear, the process is fair, and the decisions are consistent. That's what we should be aiming for. Instead, we are left with legislation that undercuts the very certainty it claims to deliver. And so, Honourable Speaker, while the Premier and his ministers may be congratulating themselves on this so-called streamlining, I urge every member in this chamber to look closer and to ask the question, are we making it easier to build or easier for government to change the rules whenever it wants? Honourable Speaker, in a democracy, when government seeks to expand its power, there is always one critical question that must be asked. Who is watching? Who is checking those decisions? Who is holding that authority to account? Who is ensuring that the public, the people who sent us here, have a voice in how that power is used? Unfortunately, Bill 14 doesn't just concentrate authority in Cabinet and the regulator, it also eliminates nearly every meaningful mechanism for public oversight. Let me start with one of the most alarming features of this legislation. Clause 14, which explicitly removes the application of the Environmental Assessment Act from a broad range of projects, including the 9 designated wind energy projects, the North Coast Transmission Line, and critically, any additional projects Cabinet chooses to add by regulation. This is not a temporary exemption. It's not a narrowly scoped exemption. This is a structural change, a long-term bypass of a process that exists to protect the public interest. Environmental assessments are not just about ecology, they are about transparency. They require a project to be reviewed holistically, to undergo technical analysis, and to include public consultation. They ensure communities can ask questions, raise concerns, and have a formal role in decision-making. By removing this requirement, Bill 14 is not just speeding things up, it's cutting the public out. And we should all be clear-eyed about what that means. Fewer voices at the table, less access to information, and zero obligation for the government to explain its decisions. Now, Honourable Speaker, the government may argue that these exemptions are only for low-impact or strategic projects. But let's be honest, those terms are never defined in the bill. There are no thresholds, no specific criteria, no requirement for impact measurement. Cabinet decides, and the rest of us are expected to accept it. But it's not just the environmental process that gets gutted. Bill 14 also gives the BC Energy Regulator the ability to delegate core functions to unnamed officials, private contractors, or government employees, with no oversight from this legislature and no clear reporting obligations to the public. Think about that. We're talking about a body that can impose retroactive fees, suspend or rewrite regulatory obligations, and now delegate those powers to others without needing to disclose who is making the decisions or how they are being made. Where is the transparency in that? Where is the basic accountability? Under normal democratic practice, when government exercises authority, there are checks and balances. There are public hearings, published reports, standing committees, and appeal mechanisms. But in Bill 14, there's none of these. Instead, it explicitly removes them. Even under the Wildlife Act safety Standards Act and Heritage Conservation Act, we see the same pattern repeated. Government decides by regulation whether these protections apply or whether they don't. That's not how good governance works. The people of this province have every right to expect that major decisions, especially those with broad environmental, cultural, or community implications, will be made with them, not around them. And yet, time and again, this bill says the opposite. It says, we'll let you know when it's done. That approach is not just wrong, it's corrosive. It breaks down trust between citizens and government. It makes communities more skeptical, not less. And it fuels the very resistance and delay this bill claims it will avoid. Because when people feel excluded from the process, they push back. They organize, they challenge, and they often do so not because they're against development, but because they were never brought in at the start. It's ironic, really. By trying to avoid public involvement, the government may well end up creating more conflict, not less. Honourable Speaker, we've seen this pattern before. We've seen it in Bill 7, where the Cabinet sought sweeping powers to override local governments. We see it in Bill 15, which bypasses democratic controls in the name of speeding up infrastructure. And now with Bill 14, we're seeing it again, this time with the added danger of regulatory and financial discretion being placed in the hands of unelected officials. The pattern is clear. This government is slowly but steadily rewriting the role of this legislature, reducing it, bypassing it, and in some cases outright ignoring it. And I ask my colleagues on all sides of this House, is that a direction we're truly comfortable with? Because regardless of how any one of us feels about a specific energy project, we should all feel uneasy about how this bill was written. We are not here to be spectators to cabinet rule. We are here to be legislators, to scrutinize, to debate, and to represent our constituents in the full light of day. That's what public accountability is and what it's all about. Not just following the rules, but making sure the people who are affected by those rules can see how they were made. That is the trust we were elected to uphold. And with Bill 14, that trust is being undermined. Honourable Speaker, we've now spent a great deal of time going through what's in this legislation and just as importantly, what's not. We've seen a bill that claims to streamline energy development, but instead centralizes authority, removes oversight, and silences public input. We've seen a government that tells British Columbians they're making the system faster, when in reality, they're just making it harder to challenge, harder to question, and harder to see. We've seen a troubling pattern, one that has unfolded across multiple pieces of legislation, where legislative power is being shifted behind closed doors into the hands of cabinet, regulators, and appointed officials with virtually no checks, no balances, and no guarantees. But, Honourable Speaker, it doesn't have to be this way. We can absolutely achieve the goal of faster project approvals. We can reduce red tape. We can provide clarity for investors, and we can still do all of that without sacrificing the principles that define good governance. So what should happen instead? First, and most critically, we must restore the role of this legislature. There is simply no justification for giving Cabinet the authority to rewrite the rules of energy regulation by decree. The powers to redefine project eligibility, impose retroactive levies, exempt assessments, and modify safety or environmental protections, those powers must be subject to debate, to scrutiny, and to vote in this House. If the government believes a project warrants special treatment, then let them make that case publicly. Let them bring that case here, where every MLA can review it, question it, and speak to the people that they represent. That is how democracy works. That is how trust is earned. And second, Honourable Speaker, this bill must include firm guardrails on retroactive authority. It is one thing to charge fees or impose conditions on future developments. That's expected. That's reasonable. But to reach back in time and penalize project proponents under rules that didn't even exist when decisions were made, that is unfair and it is unprofessional. And let me say this plainly, retroactivity is not a tool for responsible government. It's a warning sign. A warning that the government does not value certainty, that it does not respect its own legislative timelines, that it will change the terms of engagement after the fact and expect businesses to bear the cost without recourse. That's not how you encourage investment. That's how you scare it away. So if this bill is to proceed, it must include clear limits on what can be applied retroactively and include a requirement on any new levies, fees, or regulatory changes and how they're communicated in advance and applied prospectively, not punitively. Third, this bill must reinstate mechanisms for public input and accountability. This means ensuring that key oversight processes like the environmental assessment, the public request for investigation mechanisms under the Energy Resource Activities Act, and community consultations are not simply waived by regulation. British Columbians have a right to know what's happening in their backyards. They have a right to ask questions. They have a right to understand how decisions are being made and by whom. And this government, any government, has a duty to respect those rights. Because when we involve communities in the process, we allow for dialogue instead of dictation, and we build stronger projects and stronger public support for those projects. Fourth, Honourable Speaker, we need transparency in delegation. Bill 14 allows the BC Energy Regulator to delegate core authorities to individuals or groups with no clarity on who those people are, what their qualifications are, or what criteria they'll use to make decisions. If we're going to allow delegation of regulatory powers, then that process must be fully transparent and subject to reporting requirements. British Columbians deserve to know who's making decisions that affect them and how those decisions are being monitored. We can't afford to create a shadow system of energy permitting, one that operates outside of public view without recourse or oversight. Finally, Honourable Speaker, I want to speak briefly to the broader tone of this legislation and this government's approach in recent months. We are now seeing bill after bill that appears to be less about solving real problems and more about concentrating control. Bill 7 tried to give this cabinet the power to override local governments. Bill 15 will let them bypass legislative approvals for infrastructure, and Bill 14 hands them the keys to energy regulation while closing the door to transparency, accountability, and the public interest. This is not just a policy trend, it's a governance shift. One that every member of this House, regardless of party, should view with serious concern. Because if we allow the shift to continue unchallenged, we risk turning the legislature into little more than a ceremonial venue, a place where decisions are announced, not debated. And let me say directly, that is not why I ran for office. That is not why any of us are here. We are here to represent, to question, and to challenge, to give voice to the people who entrusted us with their vote and their future. And that means insisting on laws that are debated in the open, applied fairly, and built to last. So, Honourable Speaker, I will close with this. The Conservative caucus stands ready to support the streamlining of energy approvals in this province. We want to see projects move forward. We want to see BC grow, invest, and lead. But we will not support a process that strips away oversight, silences the public, and gives unelected officials the power to rewrite our laws behind the scenes. There is a better path forward, one that respects both the need for efficiency and the need for accountability. And until this government is willing to take that path, until they're willing to amend this legislation to reflect the values of democratic governance, then we must oppose this bill as it's written. Because when the stakes are this high, when the powers are this broad, and when the consequences are this far-reaching, we cannot afford to get it wrong. We owe British Columbians better than that. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.